This week's Torah portion discusses a very beautiful mitzvah that occurred in Israel. It was the sabbatical year, which basically means that for 6 years you plow, work your land. Israel was for the most part an agricultural country. And you partake, you give the tithings that you're meant to give to the poor, to the Kohen, to the priest, to the Levites. But then something amazing happens on the 7th year. On the 7th year, it's a sabbatical, like Shabbat, like Shabbat, like the Sabbath. What does that mean? That you're not supposed to work. You're supposed to let the land lay fallow. You're supposed to let the land rest. And it is available because it's like ownerless. It's available to everybody else to take, and you have equal rights to your produce just like everyone else. And God makes a promise that if you do this, I promise you that your sixth year of crop will provide for you for the 7th year and also the 8th year. Now what's interesting is that the sentence tells us that if you say, what shall I eat in the 7th year, since we may not sow or gather from the field, so God says, I promise you, like I just mentioned, you'll have for the 7th and the 8th year. What's interesting is, why would they be fearful for the 7th year? The 6th year produces for the 7th year. We find something very interesting, that the Torah already understood that there is a thing called fear and there's a thing called anxiety. Fear is when you're afraid of something that's very real. There's a threat, whether because it's happened to you before or whether it's just because you have an understanding that it's there, present, and dangerous. That's what fear is about. Anxiety is being fearful about something that hasn't even occurred yet or may never occur. It's not, as they say, a present danger. And what happens is that because we know that the 6th year may not be sufficient to last for the 7th and 8th, because the 8th is already a real fear, the anxiety begins to creep into that maybe I will not have enough for the 7th either. And what is the antidote to this anxiety? And this is, as we find that the late Lubavitcher Rebbe would often tell people when they were anxious about stuff that really was making life difficult or sometimes crippling, the Rebbe would say, why don't you read from a famous book called Shar HaBetochen, Gates of Trust? And specifically, there's a chapter that deals with having bitachon, with having trust, faith in God. Actually, more than faith. Because faith is believing that everything that God dishes out to me is purposeful. That everything that God wants from me in my life is with this grand scheme in mind. But bitachon, faith, is that everything that occurs forward is going to be pleasant, even according to my standards and my wishes. So bitachon, having faith in God, that things will be good, believing that God is in control and God wants what's best for us, and that if we really want something badly, God can make it happen, and will God be willing make it happen? So don't have the anxiety. Just because you may not have really enough for the 8th, but you know for the 7th that you can. And if you can, let's assume that you will. Today, more than ever, we have to have such faith and trust in God. There's so many difficulties facing the Jewish people and the Jewish nation that sometimes it seems so overwhelming. But just like the Jew who experienced the sabbatical year once and said, wow, this really works. I let everybody eat. They had the same rights to my field like me. And guess what? They didn't even have to work, and had enough for this year, for next year, until I went and began replanting my fields again. We all have to have trust that ultimately everything's going to work out for us, and that Hashem will make everything right. Wishing you a good Shabbos, and may it be a great Shabbos for all of Klal Yisrael, all of the nation of Israel.